All right, now let's speak more on this. We welcome Danie Meyer, professor in the College of Business and Economics at the University of Johannesburg. Prof, a very good afternoon to you. In fact, let's start with that grey list matter that we've just heard in that clip. You know, the FATF announced recently, in fact, that South Africa has been given a passing grade for a further 9 items on the 22-item action plan that was drawn up when the organization grey listed the country last year. How likely will it have, ticked off all action items by February next year to ultimately be removed from the list, do you think?
Good afternoon. Yes, the FATF grey listing does push away investors from South Africa, similar to the junk status that we have received also for the government debt. But to say we're going to achieve all of the outstanding issues by February next year, I think it's a bit wishful thinking. I would rather say that we're going to have another year or so to achieve all of these objectives. But eventually we will be able to achieve all of them and be taken off this grey listing. It was unfortunate to be on this list. Because it's very bad for the South African image to attract investment and development. So we need to get off urgently, but maybe end of next year is more achievable.
All right, so let's talk about then this year's SA Tomorrow conference, which is currently underway in New York. I mean, it has attracted considerable interest, driven by the formation of the new government of national unity specifically. How will this then play in the favor of the country and the influence it might have on policy and fiscal management as discussions continue, with South Africa obviously also having its heavy hitters in that country to woo investors?
When I speak to overseas people, they always ask me, they've heard there's a new government, and this new government is really attractive to overseas people. They were quite surprised to hear that there's a new government, but we must ensure that this new government formation is really business friendly, and they're trying to show that to all of us and to overseas investors. So they're business friendly. They are open for partnerships with the private sector. They have got a good macroeconomic outlook with stable monetary and fiscal policy. I think that's the foundation for that. I haven't seen a clear economic development plan. I think that will still be developed over time. But also the president is talking about inclusive growth. And I think that equals actually to economic development. If we can have economic development, we can lift the quality of life of everybody and not only a few people. So I think that's really important. So the outlook looks very positive from an international point of view, even the US. But there's always this geopolitical playground in the world, the West versus the East, the BRICS countries versus the Western countries. So that is a factor that we cannot forget about.
And I mean, on that note, I want to then, just go into my next question. I'll come back to what you initially said about, some of the business investors that you've spoken to about the GNU. But just in terms of South Africa's position, how critical is the message that we've heard by President Cyril Ramaphosa that South Africa is open for business and that business in South Africa is stable, especially as you consider the important task ahead of South Africa, including the G20 presidency. There's also, of course, the US elections next month, the AGOA question. You've also raised it, of course, the grey list matter and the BRICS and where South Africa stands there.
Yeah, it's quite a difficult situation for South Africa and the new government. I don't think everybody in the new cabinet is agreeing about which side we must go for. But I think the best way is to stay neutral. And any statements like Russia is one of our biggest allies and so on, I don't think it's going to be well received in the West and in the US. And we know AGOA will be renewed in the end of the year. It should be renewed. I don't think there will be any issues with that. But I feel we need to stay a little bit more neutral in terms of East versus West, in terms of our trade relations, in terms of the economy. We need the West, we need the East, we need India, we need China, we need the US. And that's very important countries for us to been a good books with. The US is one of the biggest markets, if not the biggest market, and it's a good trade partner for South Africa. It's got a positive trade surplus with the US, but not with, for example, China. We've got a very negative trade surplus with them, and our focus should be a lot to Africa. In a recent study, it showed that our biggest net exports goes into Africa and not to the east, more to the west and to Africa. That is our best trade partners where we have got a positive trade surplus. So that is very important to note.
I was listening, of course, earlier, the various conversations that are happening at the conference in New York, including, of course, Reserve Bank Governor Lesetja Kganyago in conversation with the JSE's CEO, Leila Fourie, speaking, of course, about, the country's structural reforms, playing, of course, with the theme of advancing South Africa's structural reforms. When you look at that, and just where we are as a country and what we need to do in order to address some of those reforms to grow, essentially. What then makes it, just going back to your earlier comment about how South Africa is very attractive at this stage, particularly under the GNU, governorship or government, what makes it then so attractive given those structural challenges?
Just to also prove why South Africa has been so attractive the last 5 months is the JSE is at its highest point at the moment, and that's South Africa's share. That's a very high point at this point of time. Our biggest problem is infrastructure capacity, and I think the president in this morning's speech talked about investment in infrastructure in South Africa. We are really like 25 to 30 years behind in terms of infrastructure investment. In all sectors, the electricity, rail, our ports, the roads, it is just too far behind, and we need massive infrastructure investment as soon as we can get it. And we'll need support from all directions of the private sector as well as from international investment into our infrastructure. If we cannot lift the level of infrastructure and the capacity that's available, we will not have economic growth, and we need economic growth to create jobs. We're standing at just below the 50% unemployment, and it cannot continue for a long time like that. It has been continuing for quite a long time already, but we need to stop the bleeding in terms of the job creation situation in South Africa. And jobs can only be created by the private sector, through an enabling environment through the government. And one of those main infrastructure or the enabling environment is the infrastructure availability. Another factor is level of crime. If we can reduce the crime levels and we have infrastructure, South Africa is a gold mine for international investment. And the president has tried his utmost best to attract, but it's very difficult if you have got electricity problems, you haven't got rail, your ports are struggling to export. So those things need to be addressed, and as well as the crime situation. If we can address those two major things, I'm 100% sure that we will have huge investments coming into the future with a stable government or a new government that has been formed.
Prof Meyer, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. Danie Meyer is a professor in the College of Business and Economics at the University of Johannesburg.